I know it has been on a very short notice. The invitation went out only last Monday. None of the speakers here needs much introduction. Professor James Steinberg has been a former Deputy Secretary of State, has been visiting India from time to time, and Ambassador Sipal has been a former Foreign Secretary of India. He also needs no introduction. Over to you, Ambassador Sipal.
Okay, thank you very much. I think the subject is very interesting. East Asia security challenges. As I was telling Mr. James Steinberg, it's all the more interesting because we are currently facing a bit of a problem with the Chinese, and therefore we need to understand to what extent what is happening in East Asia is linked to what is happening in Ladakh, and how the United States intends to deal with the challenges that China is posing in East Asia, because the United States is very much present there, even though it is not strictly a regional power, but effectively it is because of its defense treaties with the key players there, and of course its specific presence in the Pacific and domination of the Pacific, and therefore the insights that Mr. Steinberg will give us about what's happening in that region would be very, very useful. But before I invite him to speak, I just thought I'll mention a couple of things which would be relevant in regard to the East Asia security challenges. The foremost, of course, is China's assertiveness in the East China Sea and further down in the South China Sea. This includes the problems of Senkaku with Japan, and I understood from the Japanese, where I was a few days ago, that they are probing the Japanese political and military will on the ground by sending in their, not their navy, but their surveillance ships, even into the territorial waters of the Senkaku Islands. And we've had some statements from Prime Minister Abe, which are pretty forceful. And then we all know that Philippines, Vietnam, Malaysia, and all other Southeast Asian countries have also reason to be worried about China's assertiveness. There has been some talk of a code of conduct, not in the East China Sea, but in the South China Sea. But this has not reached any particular stage of fruition yet. I think what we are, the United States certainly even more than we, but we too would be concerned about the expansion of the Chinese Navy, all the developments on the Hainan Island, their nuclear submarine fleet. From our point of view, we would of course be quite happy if the United States succeeded in keeping the Chinese Navy bottled where it is, because there will be less of a prospect of them entering into the Indian Ocean. So therefore, there is that kind of a connection between what the Chinese might be intending to do there in terms of breaking out and access denial capabilities and everything else. It is very relevant to our own security in this part. I think in this context, your view about the strength of your defense ties with Japan, how robust they are, and how much Japan can rely on them, because you've been a bit cautious about the legal aspects of the Senkaku issue, though you have stated that that this falls within the ambit of your defense treaty with Japan. But nevertheless, the credibility of U.S.'s protective arrangements in this part of the world is certainly there in the minds of political leadership. Then in terms of East Asia security challenges, there is this East Asia Summit, and the United States has become a member, so has Russia. Can it be, or will it be, the forum for discussing such security challenges? And is it possible that we can construct some kind of an architecture there, but which is ASEAN-driven? Because at the moment, it is ASEAN-driven, but is that a realistic way to approaching the larger issues, because the core of the problem now seems to be with Japan. And then you have the additional challenge of North Korea. In this regard, the Japanese reaction, the South Korean reaction, China's role in it, will it really help to deal with this problem? Because at one level they may. At another level, they don't want North Korea to break up as a state, and then open the possibility of United States military presence extending once again back to the frontier with China. Insofar, and then there is this issue of Taiwan, which has receded in the background, but that is certainly continues to be a part of the East Asian security challenge. Insofar as India is concerned, we are an East Asia Summit member. We are now building strong relations with Japan. Our Prime Minister is going there at the end of May. The Deputy Prime Minister of Japan will be here in a couple of days. We have an India-US-Japan trilateral naval exercise arrangement, and also foreign office level talks between the three countries. So there is a community of strategic thinking that is developing, and although none of the three countries wants to present it that way, but certainly in the back of their minds there is this whole issue of what the rise of China means. So these are some of the issues on which Mrs. Steinberg, we would like to hear you, and after which I'm supposed to have a conversation with you, depending on what you say, then we'll leave it to the floor to ask you some very pertinent and pointed questions.
Well, thank you,
over to you.
It's great to be here. I've had the privilege for some time now to be involved with the Aspen strategic dialogue with India, and it's been enormously productive. And I've seen it grow over time, and to see the evolution of the program here, and all the work that the Aspen Institute is doing in India is really terrific. So I'm pleased to be here. And, I'm also pleased and delighted to have this as be the topic, because if I can start sort of where you ended, I think one of the things that's very clear from an American perspective, and I'm here as a private citizen, I don't speak for the administration, is that the United States sees India as part of the East Asia environment and has been very supportive of India playing an active role across the board, not just on the security front, but on the economic and political front as well. And that there are enormous challenges, and I'll touch on many of the points that you raised in your introduction, but it's a very strong American perspective that dealing with those challenges will be more successful the more involved India is in. And it creates a better framework and environment for dealing with the range of issues for India to see itself as an active member. And indeed, one of the reasons Okay. Better, yes. One of the reasons you mentioned the East Asia Summit, one of the reasons why at the beginning of the Obama administration we put such a priority on first signing the Treaty of Amity and Cooperation with ASEAN and joining the East Asia Summit was precisely because it was the one institution that included India as part of its structure, and therefore seemed to us the one framework within which the right countries were there for the long-term ability to deal with a range of challenges. And that, although there were other institutions and arrangements, that was one of the really compelling reasons for us to put our weight behind, as it were, the EAS as the right framework for the conversations and the evolution of cooperation within the region. It's obviously one of the wonderful things about studying and thinking about East Asia is I get to wear both of my hats, because it's both challenging from an academic's point of view, think about the challenges of East Asia, as well as a practitioner's point of view. Of course, for an academic, it's wonderful because power transitions and times of transition are the great field of study for students of international relations, and it's a great field for debate of the different theories about how states interact with each other and how we deal with the challenges of changing power relations, the relationship between rising powers and established powers and the like. And we all spend hours, debating these questions. But from a practitioner's point of view, this really, it does put to the test all the academic work, which is what do you really believe are the right strategies to deal with power transitions, and what will it take to make it possible for these transitions to take place without their leading to conflict, because we know from history that they often do. And yet if you're a practitioner, you're not going to be content just to kind of throw up your hands and say it's inevitable, there's nothing we can do about it, we're going to have conflict and war, and therefore just get used to it. You have to believe that there are strategies that can be pursued by all of the parties that will affect the outcome. And I think that has been the principal perspective that the United States has brought to bear on this question, a recognition that China is clearly a more consequential actor, and while you can't guarantee that the current trends will continue, and indeed I think there's a danger of trying to straight line this and just assume that China will become ever more powerful and successful. China faces a lot of challenges, and we can talk about that would imperil its ability to do that over time. But nonetheless, the question is it possible to imagine a world in which China is more successful economically, has greater military capacity, and yet is not a destabilizing force? And what would be the right strategy for the United States? And the choices that we have made, at least under President Obama, is to try to find a way in which we, on the one hand, demonstrate that the United States is not prepared to cede East Asia or the Western Pacific to be an area of the Chinese sphere of influence. On the other hand, that we don't believe that a strategy of containment or assuming rivalry with China is likely to produce a good result either. So how do you build an approach that can take advantage of China's increased power and capacity to help solve problems without that capacity becoming a threat to its neighbors? Now, that's not an easy challenge. It's not easy even if you assume the best in China's intentions, even if you're willing to believe their own narrative, that they seek a peaceful rise, that China needs a peaceful Asia-Pacific to pursue its own economic development. Even if you take the best case, it's still a problem because in the course of doing that, the very fact that China is becoming more powerful, building its military capacity and the like, becomes a matter of concern to its neighbors because they can't be certain about China's long-term intentions. And so you get what the IR specialists call the security dilemma, the fear that the very capacity creates uncertainty by the neighbors, and therefore they have to be prepared for the worst and take measures to build up their own capacity, which in turn causes China to take steps, and so building a negative spiral. So even in the best case, this would be a hard challenge. And of course, there are many who question the best case, who wonder whether, as time goes on, whether China will continue to pursue what it claims is its current strategy, which is not to try to use coercion or force or undue influence around the neighbors. So at the core, the U.S. Goal has been to, rather than to try to contain China, to try to make clear to China that pursuing this kind of coercive hegemonic strategy would not be successful, and therefore they might as well stick to the course that they claim to support, which is a peaceful development. So that requires a fairly nuanced hand, which is on the one hand to welcome the success of China, but on the other hand to sustain the engagement in the region that can give some reassurance to China's neighbors and our traditional allies that the United States isn't going anywhere and is going to stay the course. And yet do it in a way that doesn't look like it's a thinly veiled containment strategy. And that's what the heart of the rebalance is all about. But it is one in which you face twin dilemmas, which is on the one hand to reassure China that this is not directed at trying to weaken China. And yet at the same time you're trying to reassure China not to undermine the reassurance you're providing to your allies that they can count on you, that you will be there, and if there are threats. And that becomes particularly difficult in the context of the disputes, the territorial disputes that we're now seeing in the region. And these disputes are troubling. I mean, territorial disputes are not new. It's not, they're almost an inherent feature of international relations. I gave a talk, I just came from Korea, and I gave a talk the other day to And I reminded the listeners that, even the United States has territorial disputes. We have territorial disputes with Canada. And some of them are even maritime disputes over islands. There's an island called the Machias Island, which is off the coast of Maine, but also off the coast of Nova Scotia, which we have a significant disagreement with Canada. But nobody worries that we're about to go to war over it. Although we do each send tour boats to the island, nobody worries about how that's going to affect the outcome of sovereignty. So it is not inherently a troubling fact that states will have assertions about sovereignty, and they will be, certain that their claims are right and certain that the other side's claims are wrong. But how they get managed, obviously, is the test of how people understand the broader intentions of other countries. And so these disputes, which have been longstanding in the region, certainly the disputes between India and China, but also between China and the rival claimants in the South China Sea and between China and Japan are longstanding. But until recently, these have been relatively quiescent. And indeed, the strategy of China seemed to be one of basically deferring a resolution of the underlying sovereignty disputes and looking for cooperative measures to pursue it. And even as recently as 2008, for example, Japan and China reached an agreement for a joint exploration of the offshore resources in the East China Sea. So the problem is not so much the fact of the disputes and the certainty, that everybody has that their claims are indisputable and the like, but rather the now kind of apparent desire to operationalize through actions, which can not only heighten tensions, as we've seen between India and China, but actually, because of these operations, run the real risk of conflict. Not desired by anybody. I think everybody understands that the stakes over these disputes are low. These are not consequential in terms of, significant economic resources and the like. And yet, the danger that they spiral out of control is very, very real. Now, everybody's got their excuses and explanations, right? So China has a narrative to explain, well, the only reason it's more active in the South China Sea is because of the exorbitant claims that the Philippines and Vietnam made in connection with the law of the sea boundary demarcations. And the only reason they're more active with respect to the Senkakus is because of the action by Prime Minister Noda to nationalize the islands, and that they forced China, they had no choice but to up their game because of the actions of others. And again, that's a fairly familiar narrative that people say, well, it's the other guy who did it, not me. On some level, when you talk to Chinese officials, I think they are sincere in seeing it through that lens. But that's not unfamiliar. It's always the other guy's fault. It's never your fault. But the question is, even if you believe that the initial responsibility lies with another actor, the question is, how do you handle that? And particularly if you have to think more broadly about how the region is seeing China's growing capacity, there seems to be a special responsibility for China, I've used the word strategic reassurance, to find ways, on the one hand, to maintain its principal position. You don't expect them to say, well, never mind, we give up. But also to understand that as the rising power, with this increased military capacity and the uncertainties that its neighbors have, that China needs to find ways to maintain its principled position, as it were, without raising questions about what its long-term ambitions are. And I think that's where there are legitimate questions. It's just, why is it now that China does not seem to be taking the measures to reassure its neighbors about what its intentions are, even as it stakes its long-term claims? I think you and I were talking about this before we started. It's obviously early days in the new leadership in China. And so I think we need to be cautious about drawing big conclusions here. We need to try to see how this evolves as Xi Jinping establishes his authority and look at the broader set of measures that China takes to see whether this is a harbinger of more things to come or simply just a part of the transition. Transitions are difficult in any society. I wrote a book with Kurt Campbell just before the beginning of the Obama administration about transitions and the difficulties we in the United States have during periods of presidential transition, of really getting our hands around these problems. And so I think we don't want to prematurely draw conclusions about the long-term implications of these in terms of how Xi Jinping sees the world in the light. We need to give them some time and space to really establish the kind of new leadership that's going to be there. But we also have to be clear about what our expectations are. I think in that respect, again, in trying to see the whole picture, the one bright spot in the face of some other not so bright spots are some of the developments with respect to North Korea, which you raised. Now, obviously, the behavior of North Korea is not that bright spot. I think that there's a deep concern about how the new leadership in North Korea is taking hold and how Kim Jong-un is using tensions with South Korea and the United States and Japan to consolidate his own authority, and deep worries, frankly, about whether he understands the risks associated with the kind of reckless behavior that we've seen since he's taken leadership position. But as I say, the one bright spot is I do think that because of that, we are seeing signs that, that the Chinese leadership themselves are becoming increasingly worried about what the intentions and the risks are from North Korea, and a greater willingness both to work with other countries in the region to send an unequivocal message to North Korea about the dangers of their course, and to really begin to rethink their own strategy vis-a-vis North Korea. Now, you've raised a lot of the points that people traditionally make about why China's conflicted about the situation here. On the one hand, I think it's indisputably true that China seeks a non-nuclear North Korea. It's not in China's interest for North Korea to have a nuclear capacity. It's very dangerous for China, in fact, both because of the unpredictability and the greater likelihood of conflict that it represents, but also, frankly, because I think China understands and can see very clearly that the more threatening North Korea is, the more that forces South Korea, Japan, and the United States to take measures in response which are not welcomed by China. We've increased our missile defenses as a result of North Korea's burgeoning missile program. That's not something China is eager to see, even though it's not directed at China. It has implications for China. Frankly, you're seeing a debate, a growing debate, especially in South Korea, but to some extent in Japan as well, about whether they need to rethink about their own nuclear future. And again, that's something that China can't possibly welcome. I mean, there's certainly, you can be confident that the Chinese do not welcome the prospect of a Japanese nuclear program. And I don't think it's imminent, but I think it's just a fact of North Korea's belligerence justifies these measures. So on that, I think there's no doubt that China agrees with the rest of us that we need to try to do whatever we can to force North Korea to denuclearize. But the other part, which you mentioned, the sort of historical belief that North Korea is a valuable buffer state and that it's, therefore China has a stake in sustaining the regime there, I think is something that's beginning to be a subject of debate. You may have seen there was an op-ed about 2 months ago in the Financial Times by a fairly prominent Chinese journalist, raising the question about whether North Korea had become a strategic liability for China. Now, it's also true that this individual was removed from his position as an editor of the newspaper after he wrote the op-ed. But you have to ask yourself, I mean, the fact that somebody felt that they could pen such an article, I think reflects the fact that there is a debate going on in China. And certainly my own conversation with people close to the government suggests that there is some rethinking about whether that strategy makes sense. So to the extent that we're seeing some evolution in Chinese thinking there and greater willingness to work with others in the region, I think it's a positive sign about a new leadership that's willing to think more broadly about these questions. So we're at a very, I think, delicate period in the evolution of East Asia. It's actually, I mean, if you think about it, it's really been a remarkable period of peace and tranquility for quite a long time. And it has been a very favorable one for everybody. It's what's made the East Asian miracle possible, is that we've had a very stable security environment particularly since the end of the Vietnam War, that has, there have been challenges. You mentioned Taiwan. We've had some tense periods there, but on the whole, this has been a region of peace and stability. But lots of forces taking place in the region. Resurgent nationalism, anxieties about the future of China, reactions to that raise concerns about stability over the long run. And so that brings me back sort of in my final opening observation to this question about regional cooperation, because I do think that left alone, these bilateral relations are tricky to handle. There's history, which is very rich and perilous in the region, and the dynamics of bilateral competition can lead to these spirals of competition. But if you can embed this in a broader framework, I think you have a better chance of managing these conflicts. And I do believe, even though it's kind of evolved in unpredictable ways, that this notion of kind of an ASEAN-led regional order is actually quite fortuitous. Because nobody would accept a Chinese-led order, nor would others accept the US-led order. I mean, we're not going to recreate a NATO-type arrangement in East Asia that would be acceptable to the other countries of the region. They want good relations with China, but they also want good relations with the United States. And to the extent that the United States and China can both agree to let ASEAN be the driving force of this process, it actually tempers the rivalry and creates a framework within which there's a chance that ASEAN can use its moral authority, as it were, to lead to better behavior. And I think you can see this in this dispute about the code of conduct that you mentioned, which is, on the one hand, you're right, we haven't reached one. But on the other hand, you can also see that there's enormous pressure on China to come around on an issue that it's rather reluctant to do, because its soft power is being damaged by its unwillingness to work with ASEAN to achieve a result that ASEAN wants. And we saw this at the summit, the ASEAN summit, when it appeared that China, working through Cambodia, blocked consensus for the first time in the history of these ASEAN summits. And it might have been a tactical victory for China, but it was a Pyrrhic victory, because it reinforced a sense among many ASEAN states that China was undermining a system that had worked for others. And so I think the net result actually will be that we may well see an agreement on a code of conduct. And that in turn will be enormously important. It doesn't solve the problem, because there's no enforcement mechanism and the like, but it does set the kind of the terms of engagement. And I do think that those norms and those agreements do have a constraining impact. So I see the emergence of these multilateral structures, ASEAN-centric, as being really quite critical to managing this power transition that's taking place in the region. The United States is certainly very supportive of it. We've been very careful not to look like we're acting with a heavy hand and coming in, well, now that we're in the East Asia Summit, we've got to run it. And by the way, for Americans, as you know, it's a temptation. We get in, we like to, that's our instinct is, let's organize everybody and let's solve problems. But I think we've learned over the years that the better part of the strategy in dealing with East Asia is to understand that these are evolutionary processes, that the ASEAN way, as awkward as it is and how kind of slightly tortuous the whole consensus building process is, in the long run is actually serves our interests. So my own sense is there are real risks in the current security environment, risks that North Korea will misunderstand the intentions of its neighbors and overreach, risks that the competition and the sense of rivalry between China and its neighbors could cause an undesired and unwanted incident that could lead to greater tension, but that there's enough of a strategic interest in all the parties that we have a chance now, if we play our cards right, to actually manage this period of transition and create a new framework over the long run that incorporates China, that accommodates reasonable aspirations for China to protect its own security and to have a voice commensurate with its increasing power, but in ways that doesn't threaten the rest of the region.
Thank you, Mr. Steinberg. I think you've given us a very interesting, useful overview of how you see the situation in East Asia, and since you've held a very important government positions in the past, so even though you have made it clear you're not speaking on behalf of the government, but one can reasonably assume that the broad thinking and approach reflects, your broad thinking and approach reflects that of the administration. It was interesting to hear from you that one of the reasons that motivated you to join the East Asia Summit was India's presence in it. And maybe you could perhaps expatiate a little bit on that as to how you feel US and India could work together in the East Asia Summit, because while the security in that area has some repercussions on what potentially may happen in the Indian Ocean area, where the United States and India are now cooperating in the Indian Ocean in a big way, nevertheless, our role there is relatively limited. Number two, you not said very much about the pivot or the rebalancing, because there are some questions in people's minds as to whether the original thinking behind the pivot remains the same or it is being diluted. And in this regard, Secretary Kerry's statements when the Senate process in the Senate was going on for his appointment, some statements he made with regard to China cast some doubt on how firm the pivot would be. One thing which, of course, is not entirely germane to the subject, but which has always troubled me, is that China is increasing its military capacities very fast. And they are every time producing some new capability, whether it's the stealth fighter, or now we hear that they are more advanced than even the United States in terms of UAVs and stuff like that. Where are they getting all these technologies from? Because it is impossible that they have developed requisite indigenous capability to master such sensitive technologies to the point where they can actually work reliably in the field, and then they can export them. And now they become a huge exporter of arms too. All this may not be entirely germane to the issues we are discussing, but in a way it is, because China's assertiveness and its future role will depend on how strong it becomes. With regard to the stakes, you mentioned that the stakes in the disputes in this area are relatively low. But one hears that there are a lot of hydrocarbons in this area, and that the fight really is about control over the potential hydrocarbon resources. And then there is the larger question of the freedom of navigation, which is a very important issue, because if you were to accept the Chinese claim, then you have a real problem on the ground. And India has also come up with the view that international law should be respected, and the freedom of navigation should not be interfered with, and therefore we are on the same page in that regard. With regard to the new leadership and not reaching quick conclusions, I think you're right. But on the other hand, there is the dynamic of China's rise, especially in the last 10, 15 years, and how they are progressing in certain directions. And as they're growing stronger economically and militarily, they're becoming more assertive. So one can argue that this is independent of the personality factors in terms of who the leader is, that the Chinese thinking and policies and strategies are backed by what is happening on the ground and what has been happening in the last few years. And therefore, what might be more important might be less what Xi Jinping thinks, but how we evaluate how strong and how quickly China is going to acquire the muscle which would enable it to stand up to the United States, which is what their ambition is, to begin with the second most powerful country. And if the Chinese dream, you should say something about Xi Jinping's Chinese dream also. If that dream is to outpace the United States in every area. And finally, with regard to North Korea, you're right in terms of logic and common sense. It doesn't suit the Chinese to encourage North Korea to become nuclear because this creates problems in South Korea and then might push Japan to become nuclear. On the other hand, we know from our experience that China has collaborated with North Korea and Pakistan, and it has been very comfortable with the idea of Pakistan becoming a nuclear power. So there is a certain way the Chinese think about nuclear power and countries becoming nuclear, which raises some questions whether they really are so deeply concerned about North Korea having become nuclear. Because the assumption that we make is the Chinese always make the right policies. But this may not necessarily be true. They may also be making huge mistakes, and they have made huge mistakes in the past. Finally, there was a proposal by Secretary Clinton at one time about trilateral India, US, China dialogue, but that never got picked up. So I was wondering what the thinking behind that was, and whether that thinking still is there in some way or the other, and what would be the objective of such a dialogue in terms of stabilizing the security situation in East Asia or Asia as a whole. These are some of the things that came to my mind after hearing you, and maybe you could briefly react to that, and then we will ask the floor to ask you questions.
Excellent. Well, those are great topics, and it's a lot to chew on. Let me relate your first point with your last point, because I actually think they go together. You asked about, why do we want India to be part of this, and how do we see India? And I think there are two fundamental reasons why the U.S. really believes that India is and should be central to the long-term construction of a stable, prosperous East Asia. The first is we have a lot of interest in common. You mentioned freedom of navigation. We have, open trade and the like. I mean, we have a lot of interest in keeping this region one that preserves our interest, that deals with problems like piracy and terrorism and the like. These are common interests that are going to be dealt with in an East Asian context, and therefore having a partner who shares those interests, I think, is very valuable, and who believes, frankly, in rules-based solutions to these problems, which India, I think, is very much committed to. So in that sense, it's a like-minded state that is welcome to have as part of this engagement. But the second part is not so much on like-mindedness, but I think that India, I mean, as you know, there's always been kind of this, I think, silly view by a small number of Americans that somehow India would be a partner with the U.S. in containing China. I have never believed that. I can't imagine that there'd be an explicit Indian strategy to contain China, and certainly that India would partner with the United States to contain China. So I don't think that's a motivation for doing this. But I do believe that India shares the United States view that we don't want to see any one power dominate the region and be able to coerce others to join it as part of a new sphere of influence. So to that extent, I think there is a shared commitment that India has a stake in maintaining the sovereignty and independence and freedom of action of the other states of East Asia, which we share, and that's an important voice that creates a more plurilateral environment in East Asia, which serves everybody's interests. So it's not so much that it's an alliance against China, but it is part of the broader counterweight against anybody becoming a dominant force in the region. And that's a very attractive long-term solution to, I think, stability. So for those two reasons, I think that we have a stake. Now, where's the trilateral idea fit in? Well, I think that's part of it, is that by having a trilateral dialogue, it makes clear to China that we don't seek to build a U.S.-Indian relationship against China, right? This is not, some kind of new part of a containment strategy, that we're working together, but that the more we can find ways to identify a common set of interests, that we create a structure that resists this idea of it's 2 against 1 or 1 against 2, but actually, common frameworks. We've also advocated, I have and the administration's advocated, a trilateral U.S.-Japan-China dialogue for the same reason, to try to break down these kind of us against them environments. It's also why the United States supports the Trilateral Japan, Korea, China dialogue, because the more we have these both broad frameworks and then these sub-dialogues within it, the US, India, Japan dialogue, which we now have, you mentioned. This all creates, again, a more plurilateral environment within the region that allows people to explore areas of common interest, that helps break down suspicions of containment and balancing. And so that's, I think, the motivation behind that idea. I think you made a very good point about it's important not to put too much emphasis on the individual leaders in China and to think about the long-term interest. In part because even if we knew the interest of Xi Jinping, we have to think about who's going to come after him and who's going to come after him. And so I would say, I think it is right to think about what are China's long-term goals and ambitions, and how do we, in turn, shape those? Because I don't think they're fixed in stone. I mean, I think even if they have a conception today, it could change over time. Well, two of them, I think, are indisputable and likely to be relatively invariant. One, China is preoccupied with making sure that there's never a repetition of the century of humiliation. That China will never be again so weak that it can be, at the extreme, lose its sovereignty, as it did during the 19th century to Europeans and in the 20th century to Japan. So it's going to do whatever it can within its capacity to make sure that it is as little vulnerable as to that kind of coercion or occupation as it can. And that won't change. But that's no different than any state. No state wants to be vulnerable to coercion or pressure. Second is the sovereignty issues. And again, I think that, as you say, is something that is a sustained and long-term interest. That a part of the narrative about the century of humiliation is that China believes that during that period, integral parts of its territory were taken from it, and that part of regaining its sovereignty and its lack of vulnerability is to regain its sovereign possessions. And if you listen to the Chinese talk about the dispute over the Senkakus or the South China Sea, they couch it in terms, particularly with the Senkakus, the East China Sea, is that they believe that the resolution at the end of World War II of the Potsdam and Tehran declarations were a commitment to restore the territory taken by the Japanese, and they count the Senkakus as part of that. The Japanese disagree. They agree that the Pescadores and Taiwan were part of that, but they don't agree with this. But taken in its own terms, you can understand the Chinese narrative to say this is just recovering Hong Kong, Taiwan, parts that were taken from them. And those, I think, are invariable. But the question is there more? I mean, is it in addition to reducing their vulnerability to pressure and coercion by others or invasion by others, in addition to regaining what it believes is its long-term historic territory, does China aspire to become the regional hegemon and to dominate others? That's the place where things get dicey, because that's not going to be acceptable to China's neighbors or to us. And so the challenge is to try to create an environment where China understands that some of its aspirations may be legitimate, but others would not be and would be resisted by others. And second, even among those legitimate aspirations, that there are acceptable ways to pursue them and not acceptable ways to pursue them. So its claims to sovereignty are understandable. As I say, states do that all the time. But we need to be clear that it should not try to achieve those claims through force and through intimidation, and that there are other venues to resolve these questions, which up until recently China had seemed to be prepared to do. Now that's related to its increased capacity, because the Chinese would say, I think, that we've always had the position that these belong to us, but we were too weak to do anything about it. Now we're not weak anymore, so now we're in a position to protect what is ours. And I think the answer has to be back that no, you're not. I mean, that it's not a question of whether you have the capacity to do it. It's a question of how will others react if you use this capacity to try to force your solution on others. And I think that's why we are at such a delicate time. In terms of their military capacity, there's no doubt that they're getting better and their technology is getting better, but I think there's a tendency to exaggerate this too. They're not 10 feet tall. Their technology does not, their military capabilities don't seriously rival the United States. The advances that they've made, are consistent with the fact that they're moving up the technology curve, but I don't think, reflect a fundamental change in the relative balance. I think one should not underestimate the quite significant lead that the United States continues to have, both in fielded capacity and the ability, if China really wants to have an arms race, for our ability to stay well ahead of them, nor the determination, frankly. And this goes to your question about the rebalance. As I have no doubt at all that even though we have fiscal difficulties and the like, that the United States, on a bipartisan basis, is quite committed to the sustained engagement, and should this become more contentious and more competitive or rivalrous, that there will be support of the United States to do whatever is necessary, not only to protect our own security, but to sustain our commitments to the security of others. Now, having just come from South Korea, I know there's anxiety about it. You're right. People wonder, will the United States really stay the course? Will they, be prepared to do this in the face of other changes in the region? But I think there's a deep understanding, and a very bipartisan and broad-based one in the United States, that this region is the defining region of the 21st century, and that the United States has to stay in the game. As Secretary Gates said, we are a resident power. We need to be there. It is critical to the long-term stability and the security and prosperity of the United States for us to be there. So, I think that very fact of doing that, I think, creates a better chance that China will direct its energies to, more peaceful and cooperative strategies rather than more confrontational strategies. So I know people try to parse everything that Secretary Clinton or Secretary Kerry or the President says, but my strong personal conviction is that determination is quite serious. And again, not to weaken China, to contain China, to threaten China, but to recognize that we'll all be better off if there's a kind of confidence that the United States will be there in a sustained way.
Well, thank you very much. Now we can have questions from the floor. What we can do is, since we don't have too much time, we can take almost all the questions at one go. And
Great.
I can see that you retain the questions very well, and you don't need to take down any notes.
Great.
So,
I'm General Sharma. I just have a basic question. You see, your experience of Afghanistan and Iraq has definitely given a very important lesson that the hard power, use of hard power has its own limitations. And with that lesson in mind, perhaps, and also the financial factors, American involvement in Libya and other parts of West Asia and all has been more in a supporting role rather than leading. Now, if this is what the lesson is, and if this is what is going to be applied in East Asia, I think it's totally different there. And the apprehensions which the countries there have are very well founded. And if America is not going to lead the charge there and allow the Chinese to have the good sense to let the region be peaceful, because after all these territorial disputes the territory, the islands have been there since time immemorial. So why have these disputes come now? And to say that containment of China is something which has not worked or which will not work, are we going to allow China to break out into the Pacific and the Indian Ocean? That is one. But the only saving grace is, if I can just finish.
shall we limit it to that? Because
No, just one line, that I think China is following the same by using hard power to pursue its national interest, what is happening in Ladakh and elsewhere. So therefore, I think we need to have a good look at what we are doing in East Asia, because this is totally different than what is in West Asia.
Somebody has raised the, If you can make your question short, maybe it'll be helpful.
Definitely. Can you hear me? Yeah. Now that you're an academic, Dean Steinberg, what is your position, since everything is interrelated, as we've discussed, between South Asia, East Asia, Central Asia? What is your feeling that in the India-China dispute, which party is really right and which party is wrong? Because I think that most of us Indians obviously feel we are in the right, and I'm sure the Chinese authorities feel the same way. So I'd like your opinion as an academic, forgetting about your past.
Well, you talked about your territorial disputes with Canada. I'll ask the High Commissioner of Canada. He wants to ask you a question.
Of course, Taiwan's always a very sensitive issue to the Chinese. I'm curious, given the American position in Taiwan and how the Chinese
International Tribunal for the Law of the Sea, I was curious, I was interested in hearing what you were saying about China's capacity increasing, and it's not confined only to military capacity, and I would add to that legal capacity. And I wondered if you've been able to analyze the latest steps in the attempt by the Philippines to bring arbitration to the South China Sea.
Yes. I think maybe that could be the last question, and because we're running out of time.
Great question.
But one last question from there.
Yeah.
Sorry, well, I'm a Maxwell alum, so maybe I get
Excellent.
special points.
Perfect.
I handle the Tibetan Kashmir programs for the Friedrich Naumann Foundation for South Asia. So obviously watching China is one of main things. But for us, when we look at China, the external problems or its aggressive posture overseas was already reflected by its aggressive posture internally, whether it's Inner Mongolia, Xinjiang, or Tibet, or the Tibetan Autonomous Region. And I mean, there was a lot of hope with the new administration that in mainland China there would be a little more opening for at least anti-corruption work, but there's been a back on that, as in it seems that if China, a test to China is how liberal it is with its own people. If it's not liberal with its own people, it's not going to be liberal with its neighbors. And so a question is, how do you see that going forward?
Great. It's a great question and obviously people are worried about the implications of our withdrawal from Iraq and soon to be withdrawal from Afghanistan. But I draw a slightly different lesson than you did, because I don't think it's a lesson about hard power. I think it's a lesson about what are the objectives, and particularly the limitations of a land occupation for the United States. So I don't see a necessary conclusion from how we have now, Secretary Gates saying we're not going to fight any more land wars in Asia, to dealing with the balance of power issues in East Asia, which don't largely implicate that. They really are places that in some ways play to American strength, the ability to project power, than not having to have that kind of sustained counterinsurgency type involvement. These really are about much more traditional state-to-state conflicts. And so in many ways, certainly if you listen to the people on the more military side of this, this is, with air sea battle and all of that, this is actually a place where there's a higher comfort level that the United States is well positioned to do it. So I don't see a connection between our desire to disengage from the kinds of roles we played in Iraq and Afghanistan as leading to us, therefore, wanting to play a lesser role or less active role in East Asia. Now, I agree with you. That doesn't mean that our friends in East Asia aren't worried about that, but I think the answer back is a pretty convincing one, and I believe over time it will be seen to be convincing as we sustain the presence and do the kinds of modernization and preparedness that we need to do to deal with that challenge. But there's no doubt that the concern that you identified is out there, and I think it's very important for American policymakers to explain why they shouldn't draw the false conclusion from the withdrawal and the limitations of what we did in Iraq and Afghanistan to dealing with the different kinds of challenges that we face in that region. I think that as we think about the conflicts, and I didn't mention my view about the resources. There are hydrocarbons there, but these are not the pot of gold at the end of the rainbow. They're useful, they're valuable, but it's also true that up until 2 or 3 years ago, there were agreements by most of the parties for joint exploration. So there are plenty of ways to deal with this if this were only an economic issue. So I do think it is much more about sovereignty. And I do think that in terms of the narrative of the leadership in China, that a lot of their legitimacy is, this is goes back to Mao's observation about China has stood up, that this is sort of reclaiming what was lost during a period of weakness. So it's much more about these, symbolic restorations of sovereignty than it is about significant economic interests. And, and that's why I think that, your question about the arbitration is interesting, because on the one hand, this is, China claims to be operating under the law of the sea and the like, and yet doesn't seem to be willing to risk a resolution of these problems on terms that might not lead to a success. And that's, of course, worrisome, because it suggests that they aren't prepared to allow dispute mechanisms and the like to go forward, and that there's only one outcome that they will accept. But that's why I would be surprised to see China accept the Philippines' proposal to move in that direction. In part, it's, I'm a lawyer by training, but not an expert in the law of the sea. But it's apparent to even those of us who are not great experts that many of China's claims are just patently not credible under the law of the sea. The nature of their claims, the so-called historic claims to the 9-dash line, the cow's tongue, are just not law of the sea based type claims. And many of the disputes we have with them, including the issues about the presence of our military ships in the EEZ, are also not, they're extreme minority views about the law. So it would be nice to think that we could find a law-based solution for these problems. It would also be nice if the United States ratified the law of the sea treaty. It would put us in a better position to make those claims, but I don't know whether the Senate will be persuaded to do so. I certainly hope that they do. But I think that it is a good framework that we ought to try to get them to bring themselves within. But I just think because of the resonance of this issue politically for the leadership there, it's going to be hard for them to do that, which goes then to the Taiwan issue, right? And, the good news on Taiwan is, even though everybody thinks the current situation is unsatisfactory, it's less unsatisfactory than all the other alternatives. And it's, at least in the near term, I think, relatively stable. There's not a huge amount of pressure on Taiwan to resolve the ambiguity. For all, it moves back and forth, but the general sentiment in Taiwan seems to be reasonably comfortable with the status quo. If the issue doesn't get raised too visibly, I think the leadership in China can relatively live with the status quo as well. We had kind of a flare-up over the arms sales back in January of 2010. I don't think the United States is going to decline to somehow stop doing it. And I think, along with what I said about the other territorial disputes, as China becomes stronger, there is more pressure on the government to say, well, you tolerated the arms sales when you were weak, but now you're not weak, so you shouldn't do it. But I'm not sure what the options are for China to do it. We saw during the January 2010 arms sales threats against American firms that China would impose sanctions against American firms that provided weapons to Taiwan. But that isn't going to change the decisions of the U.S. government. So my sense is that absent some really unlikely set of events, that the near-term management of this is possible, and the long-term really depends on both what happens internally in China and internally on Taiwan. So one should never become too complacent about these things, but I think in terms of how each of the sides is managing it, there's a degree of prudence and understanding about long-term interest that give me some confidence. On the internal, you raised a very good question about this, but the one thing, you can't be sure about a lot of things about the leadership in China, but one of them you can be absolutely sure of is they think that one of the great historic mistakes was what Gorbachev did in Russia, right? This is, every Chinese leader will tell you, that was, the most foolish, and we're never going to let that happen. So whatever the discussions are about liberalization and reform in China, there's simply no tolerance among the Chinese leadership for direct challenges to the authority of the Communist Party. And that lots of liberalization, rule of law stuff can happen, but they will not allow that to happen. We saw that in response to the colored revolutions. We saw that in response to the Arab Spring. And indeed, the lesson is not only should you not let that happen, you have to kind of almost overreact to deter anybody from thinking that there's any chance that that can happen. And I also don't see that changing. I mean, this is a kind of it's a learned lesson. Whether it's a right lesson, I would obviously disagree, but it is deeply a learned lesson for the Chinese leadership. And so with respect to the issues that you talked about, I don't anticipate any sign of a change of view on that. And I think it's unfortunate because I think it's not in China's interest. And I'm not sure how long that strategy will be successful. I mean, I do believe over time that the growing economic success of the Chinese people and its exposure to the world just makes this strategy one that can't permanently succeed. But I don't see any sign that that's a perception of the Chinese leadership.
Well, thank you very much. About this business about century of humiliation, I have a feeling that the Chinese overdo this. Because if India were to talk about its centuries of humiliation and on that basis, develop its foreign policy and its sense of grievances against the rest of the world, I don't think that would be very constructive. I think we tolerate too much this Chinese grievance that they have suffered at the hands. China has become so strong in the last 30, 40 years. There's no ghost of a chance that anybody can subject China once again to the kind of humiliation that they suffered. And it's such a huge country geographically. I admit that even large countries are very sensitive about territorial issues.
But let me just say, but the one thing that I think is important that makes it slightly different is that, as I said, because the CCP is not an elected government, they have to root their legitimacy in other things. And for the Chinese government, it's rooted in two things. Most importantly, on economic success. I mean, if they deliver, the public will largely support it. But also, the nationalist narrative is a part of the legitimacy. And to the extent that, I mean, there is their own logic on this, which makes it for a party of the kind that they are, it adds more salience to this than it might in a different, more democratic political system.
But it's worrisome because this has undertones of some kind of historical revanchism, which for a power that is aiming to be a global power is worrisome, because then they look at international relations and the environment in a perspective which doesn't fit into what it should be in terms of an interdependent
and
globalized
I know I
world.
didn't answer your question about who is right, and I won't, even though I'm an academic, in part because I think that that it's, in some respects, it's always better in these situations for, I mean, somebody mentioned, or you may have mentioned this, what some people think is the ambiguity about our position on the Senkakus. But, I mean, the United States doesn't take positions on other people's territorial disputes. As the British will tell you, on the Falkland Islands, they are closest ally. We declined to take a position. No, but it's not. It's even as an academic, one can talk about the different natures of the claims. But I think it's quite important that really it doesn't matter who's right. What matters is how people handle it, right? And what's worrisome about the current events is not whether China's right or India's right, but people who are trying to unilaterally determine the result rather than finding cooperative strategies for dealing with it. And so that's why I'm resisting it, because the right answer is not to decide who's right. The right answer is for the two sides to come to a mutually satisfactory agreement. And it doesn't matter what that is or what the historical antecedent is, so long as both of the sides, without coercion or threat or use of force, come to a common view, because that's the only durable solution. I gave a talk, and I talked about this when I was in Korea. One of the great little successes of the Clinton administration is we helped mediate a longstanding territorial dispute between Peru and Ecuador over their border. And they had gone to near war over it 3 times. And they ended up by creating a peace park around the disputed area. And so now both sides continue to claim that they were right, but it doesn't matter. And so whether it's your border or the Senkakus, what's important from the U.S. perspective is that, one, that it's resolved through dialogue and without the use of force or threat of force.
I hope you didn't suggest to our side to convert Siachen into a peace park.
You can do whatever you want as long as you can find a way to agree on it.
Well, thank you very much, Mr. Steinberg. That was very illuminating, very
Thank you for
frank,
having me.
candid,
Great
very
to see you.
articulate.
Thank you all for coming.
And let's give him a big hand. How long are you going to stay?
Just tomorrow. I'm very appreciative that your successor is going to see me tomorrow, so I'll have a chance to see him and see